We're going to continue now in our discussion about chimutz. If you remember, we established yesterday that there's a lav. In fact, we're going to see two lavim. There's a lav in the Torah that prohibits being mechametz the mincha. And we said that kol mechametz mincha, if he goes ahead and he adds some sort of an agent of leavening to cause chimutz of the mincha, he violates a law. The Torah says that lo kol mincha asher takrivu l'Hashem lo te'asa chametz, and therefore he is enjoined from being mechametz the mincha. But not only that, he has an essay of matzah tir. It must be matzah. So we have two dimensions here. Number one, the mincha becomes invalid as a result of chimut, because the Torah says that the mincha has to be matzah. And number two, he violates a law of lo te'aseh chametz. Now, in addition, the Torah says not only lo te'aseh chametz, but also lo te'efeh chametz. And the first set of psukim are in the second chapter of Vayikra. The last pasuk of Afiyah is in the sixth chapter of Vayikra. And we spoke about the possibility of his doing chimutz at many different possible stages in the bringing of the mincha, whether it might be in the lisha stage, perhaps in the aricha stage, the afiyah for sure. And then we're up to the following issue. This is where we left off yesterday. What happens in a case where the mincha is a mincha psula? It's in any event disqualified. And then he's mechametz the mincha. Let's say, for example, he took the mincha out of the azara, which is called a psul of yotze. And then he went ahead and he was mechametz the isa. So the halacha is that in such a case he's not chayav, because the Torah says you're only chayav to be if you were mechametz an isa, a mincha that should have been kshera and was kshera until the point in which you disqualified it by being mechametz. But if the mincha is already disqualified, it was already yotze, as one example, and then you were mechametz the isa, you're not in violation of the law. And that's a Gemara in Masechta Menachos on Daf Nun Zayin. Okay. Now the Gemara has the following suffix. This is fascinating. Because in every suffix in the Gemara, you could hear both studying. Here, I think it's obvious. I don't know why the Gemara vacillates about this. Mechametz es ha-mincha, the achakach yotza. In other words, at the time of his first action of chimutz, the mincha was a mincha kshera. He's certainly chayav for that first action. But then v'yotza. Then he took that mincha out of the azara, and it's possibly din yotze. V'achka chazar v'chimtza. A second time around, he was mechametz. Because as we discussed yesterday, there are different stages in the process of leavening. So he reached level number one. It wasn't completely leavened. And then he was mechametz achar mechametz. And for every action of chimutz, he's going to be chayav. But here, wedged in between the first action of chimutz and the second was yotze. He took it out of the azara. And the question arises in my mind, why would anyone entertain the possibility that he'd be chayav for the second chibur. So after all, we said and we established, nobody argued about this, there is no violation of the law of chibur on a mincha psula. And the mincha is clearly psula because he took it outside of the mikveh. So now the Gemara analyzes the stuff. Ha'im, shall we say, which is intuitive, Eino chayav al chibutz, the second process of chibutz could not generate a few, mishum shekvar nifsala biyotze. It's clearly a mincha psula. Oh, Dilma, now let's try to figure out the second side. Me'acha shekvar hischamtza b'chibutz harishon shuv lo hoyel lo psul yotze v'yesh l'chayvo gam al chibutz Hashem. In other words, when we say that the mincha psula is not subject to the law, the violation of chibutz, that's because there was a chalos psul. In the halachic radar screen, it registered as a psul. But after he did the first chibutz, the yotze could not be registered. So we're back to a case of chibutz achar chibutz. Meaning, that when do we say that he's potter, he's exempt, and he's not liable for the violation of machamitz because it's already possible? That's with regard to any psul other than chibutz. But with regard to chibutz, we have a principle called yesh machamitz achar machamitz. And for two actions of chibutz, you're going to be chayav in a sequence of A, time T1, time T2, even though the mincha is already psula as a result of the first chibutz, but yet we have a principle of yesh chibutz achar chibutz, so yesh machametz achar machametz. Now what happened is, there was a yotze situation, but the yotze situation was after the first machametz. So once you did the first machametz, you no longer have a mincha kshera. And taking it out of the Azara is totally irrelevant. Like, for example, let's say after you did the first acts of machametz, I noticed that this Kohen is about to take this mincha out of the Azara. Should I warn him and prevent him from doing so? Absolutely not. There's no need to do so because there's no psul yotze that could register in the halachic universe after the first ma'aseh machametz. So what you're left with is machametz achar machametz. So you chai for both chibutzes, one for the first and then another one for the second. You know, the truth is, I went from one extreme to the other. At this point, I don't even understand what the Havamina was, what the suffix of the Gemara was, that he should not be chayav. I thought initially, well, for sure he's not chayav because it's after psul yotze. But now that we said that the yotze is not registered, it's not a psul yotze because there's no psul yotze in the case of a mincha psula. I don't understand the first side. I don't understand why he shouldn't be chayav for the second chibutz because we have a principle of yesh chibutz achar chibutz. Now we're going to discuss something called Rosh HaMizbeach. There are obviously two stages in every korban. One stage, when we're moving towards the Hakatorah. One is to bring whatever has to burn on the Mizbeach on top of the Mizbeach. And number two, to actually put it on the fire. Now, the halacha of Rosh Mizbeach, the top part of the Mizbeach, creates a certain status in Kodshim that has many repercussions. For example, there's a psul called lina. If you leave the Kodshim overnight, past its allotted time, it becomes possible the next morning. Not so al Rosh HaMizbeach. The Rosh HaMizbeach creates a certain protective covering, and it prevents the psul of lina. How does Rosh HaMizbeach play a role in our discussion about the lav of chimutz. Hamachametz es hakometz b'Rosh HaMizbeach. He did the chimutz when the mincha was already on its way to Haktorah, and it didn't reach the stage of Haktorah, but it's close to Haktorah. It's al Rosh HaMizbeach. And once again, we have a suffix whether he's chayav from machametz. What's the suffix? The Torah says, "Kol mincha asher takrivu." Let's go back to the pasuk, right? The pasuk says, "Vayikra beis pasuk yidalf." We should actually open a chumash here. It says, "Kol mincha asher takrivu Hashem lo te'asa chametz." Which means that a mincha that anticipates hakrava. So the words asher takri kol mincha asher takri Hashem means that you are going to be makriv lo te'asa chametz. You're not allowed to make it into chametz. Obviously, if it's already past Haktorah, the korban is complete, the mitzvah has been fulfilled, there's no room for chibutz, for being mechayev him, or for passing the korban, b'toras chametz, because he's already done Haktorah. Clearly, in our case, he was mechametz the mincha before the Haktorah, but nevertheless, the Gemara thinks in one side that since it's already on Rosh Hashanah, it's already considered as if the Hakrava reached its fruition. And for all intents and purposes, it's already considered Muktar al Gavi Mizbech, and therefore it's no longer subject to the Isur Lav and Machametz. So the Gemara says, Safek, Ha'im hi nifseles mishum chimutz, and nifseles also means that he violated the law. Shekei nemar be'isur zeh kol ha'mincha asher takriva, that we're anticipating that krova. V'arei kfar hekriva. Interesting. Sometimes the Torah uses the word kapara to indicate the termination and the completion of the avoda and of the validity of the korban. And clearly, if the Torah would have indicated that we're completing the process, then there's no room for this suffix. However, the Torah uses the word takriv, which literally translates as bring it closer. Right? To be makariv something, to bring it closer to the H for the purpose of Haktorah. But he didn't get to that point, but he did get hakrava. He has brought it closer by bringing it up to the Rosh HaMizbeach. All he has to do now is one last little action and then take it from wherever it is on the Rosh HaMizbeach and plop it down, throw it down onto the Maruch, onto the edge. So in this case of Rosh HaMizbeach, the Gemara has a tzad to say that it's already considered Asher Takrivu. It's no longer anticipating Akrova. You already have Akrova. You've gone far enough in the process by placing it on the Rosh HaMizbeach, where it's now accessible to Haktorah, and therefore there's no longer halach of chibutz. O Dilma, the other side of the Gemara is to say, Kevan Shalom Nitna Adayan ala H, it hasn't yet been placed on the fire. Adayan hi mechuseres Haktorah, the Eina Nechsheves le Hakrova. Until you have Haktorah, you don't have Hakrova. And therefore, it's mechuseres Maisa. You can't call it already after Haktorah, after Hakrova, because you need another Maisa to take the mincha and place it onto the H. And in this tzad, it's not enough that it's on the Rosh Hashanah. So this is the sugya in Menachos. I wish we could go and learn the sugya inside, because I have a feeling that this has to be placed within a broader context of Kodshim, in other words, in terms of the status of Rosh Hashanah. Okay. Now, what happens after the comments, right? Everything in the avoda of mincha revolves around the kmitza. He did the kmitza, and now he takes that comments, and instead of putting it on the mizbeach, he's machametz the comments. So then, for sure, he violates the law. What happens after he violated this law, heaven forbid? He's now got a kometz shehechmitza, and then he takes it on to the H and he's makter. Is there a violation of a law of haktaras kometz shehechmitza that's already chometz? And now we have another pasuk. We already had 3 different verses in the Torah. Now we have a 4th verse. And the Torah says, Ki kol si'ar v'chol dvash lo saktiru mimenu ishe lashem. Now, offhand, I'm going to translate the lav. It's not relevant to our case, but we'll see how it is very relevant to our case. Our case is that he has a kometz shehischametz, and now he's maktir on the ish. And we're going to establish that he's chayav for this violation of the law. This violation of the law is when he takes si'ar or dvash, and he's maktir on the mizbeach. Did you hear anything about dvash? The answer is that it says not only dvash in the pasuk, but it also says si'ar. And we can assume that any time that there's chibutz, then by definition it's classified as si'ar. Adkan hakofa alf, now hakofa beis. What happens in this case of si'ar, meaning it's already a komet shechmitza, and he didn't get it all the way to the fire, but he's on his way up the ramp of the mizbeach. That's called the kevesh hamizbeach. Hamayla also lekevesh. Why? The Torah says, "Ki kol sior b'chol dvash lo saktiru." Okay, it's very nice. He's a bad guy, he's carrying the mincha up to kevesh. But where's the lo saktiru? How did he violate that law? Now we have a 5th. Well, what number are we up to? No, 5th pasuk. Pasuk says, "V'el hamizbeach lo yalu." What does that mean? You and I would have said El Mizbech Lo Yalu is referring to Haktarah, but it can't be, because we already have a lot of Lo Saktiru. So what does it mean after Lo Saktiru? The Torah tells me El Mizbech Lo Salu. The Torah is telling me you're not even allowed to take it up the Aliyah, meaning up the Kevesh of the Mizbech. And this reminds me again of a different sugya in Kodshim about what the status of the Kevesh is. And the Gemara vacillates about that, has a possibility that the kevesh itself has halacha, a status of the mizbeach. In any event, the Torah says al mizbeach lo yalu, with reference to sior and dvash. Here we have a case of komet she's chametz and has the status of sior, and he violates al mizbeach lo yalu by taking it up the kevesh. Okay, now we get to Hakaf and Gimel. What happens in the following scenario? he has two menachos. One mincha is matzah, kedasu kidin, and the other is chametz. With regard to the chametz, he's not allowed to be makted. And he mixes these two together, and he pours them on the mizbeach, on the edge. He violates the law of haktoras chametz. Why? Because the Torah includes, through a ribui, in this lav, even a tarovetz of chametz. Next, what if he takes half of the chametz and he's mechametz half of the chametz? Is he chayav only if he's mechametz the entire chametz or even half of the chametz? And the Gemara establishes chayav af al chatzi chametz. Now, how much is in the chametz? The Isar Aktorah and the lav of Lo Saktiru only applies to a minimum of kizayis. And now you're telling me that for chatzi chametz he's chayav? The answer is that we're talking about a haktorah of half of a chametz, but there's a zayis worth in the half of the chametz, meaning the chametz is a minimum of 2 zayis. However, on that we have a machlokas Abai v'Rav. According to Rava, you're not chayav haktorah of a chatzi zayis because it's just like there's no achila of a chatzi zayis. There's no haktorah of a chatzi zayis. You didn't violate the lav lo saktiru on a half a zayis, and therefore, if you're chayav for half of a kometz, it must be that half of the kometz had already a kizayis. But Abai says that no, there's a difference between achila when the Torah prohibits achila and haktorah. Haktorah applies when you have Kodshim, any amount whatsoever. We don't need a kizayis. And therefore, Abai has a very simple way of understanding why you're chayav in the case of a chatzi kometz. We don't have to say that the chatzi kometz was a full kizayis' worth, because Abai postulates that the lav of haktorah applies even in less than a kizayis. Okay. Now, when we talk about menachos, and we assume that the menachos have to be matzah and not chametz, every rule has its exception. And in this case, we have, I think, 2 exceptions to my knowledge. The first exception is shtei al lechem. So we're talking about Chag HaShavuos. And here the entire carbon is chametz. It's shtei al lechem, that's all, nothing else. Later on, we'll talk about Toda, where you have a combination of lechamim that are chametz and matzah. But now we're talking about shtei al lechem. The Torah says chametz to afena, right? So the shtei al lechem has to be chametz. And now we have a machlokas tanon. L'das Rabbi Meir, motzi mi'at me'asolas li'achar medidasa be'isoro, v'loshal so b'fnei atzmo achkach tomno b'solas an shenasa sior u'mimenu mischametz shar habotzak. L'das Rabbi Yehuda, maybe sior michometz yofer, Beso Mosif also with Solus at Yuchla mi ben Shneim Shir Isor. So whereas Rabbi Meir allows you to take a little part of the Solus, so you measure the Solus as an Isor, and then you can take off a part of it. He doesn't say if there's a minimum amount, but you take off part of it, and you add CR, which is a leavening agent. And you go through the entire process of lisha, which means you knead the soles, and then you put the soles in a place, wherever it is. You leave it for a certain number of minutes, let's say 18 minutes, and then it becomes CR. So from this ma'at soles, which now, after its own lisha, just a small part of the soles, it became CR, and now I can use that CR in that smaller part of the soles to be machametz the rest of the soles and create my shtei. That's the shita of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yehuda holds ein lito ma'at me hasoles. We do not allow you to take off some small part of the soles after its medida and to be mechametz it outside of the rest of the soles, but rather maybe si'ar mechumans yafe mi beso most of the soles. Take the entire volume of the soles, add an agent, a leavening agent of what he calls a si'ar mi beso. So let's say, for example, yeast is a leavening agent. So let him find yeast. He buys yeast in the local makolet, and he adds the yeast to the entire soles. And what's going to happen is that after he adds the yeast to the soles, he has an isaron in order to bake it as shtei lechem. He's not going to allow, as Rabbi Meir did, to take off a certain segment or part, what he calls a ma'atne soles. Ulachmitza michutzala, and then after he takes ma'atne soles, Rabbi Meir says it became chametz. Now it's an agent that he could add to the rest of the balance of the soles. Became, says Rabbi Yehuda, I'm not going to allow that. Haroa yomar shahosif siar zeh michutz b'nosaf al shir ha'isaron shekfar yeshno b'soles b'yizbar shemosif al shiuro haron. The onlooker doesn't know what exactly is the volume of the balance of the soles, meaning he takes that small part of the soles and he uses it now as a leavening agent, adding it. He may think, mistakenly, that he already has a sheer isaron in the soles. And now, by taking that small piece that he fermented, if I could use that word, I don't know, maybe that's not the right word. Anyway, after it's leavening and adding it in, the onlooker thinks that he's adding more than isaron. And if you remember, we said that the shear of a mincha has to be miduyak, it has to be precise and meticulous. It can't be more, it can't be less. And the roeh is going to get the misimpression, according to Rabbi Yehuda's attack of Rabbi Meir, meaning if according to Rabbi Meir, this is what we're going to do, we're going to add that piece because we started with a medida of isaron, we took off, let's say, 1/10 of the isaron, we machametz it, now we're adding it back in. The onlooker doesn't know that this was part of the original isaron, and you're just being mashlim the original isaron. The onlooker, the roeh, thinks mistakenly that there already is an isaron, and you are adding another ingredient into this mixture, and you're doing something that's unacceptable because you're being mosif al ashir, and we said that mosif al ashir means it should be possible. So therefore, in order to avoid any confusion, Rabbi Yehuda insists that you add any sort of leavening agent into the entire solus. Well, wait a minute. Let me just the last formulation. Maybe I went a little too far. What I mean to say is that if he has, let's say, 9/10 of an isaron, then he adds CR for that 1/10 of the isaron to be mashlin the shear of the isaron. Just one more line to finish this whole section. Nechleku tanoim amim efshal lahachmitz et shtei alechem v'tapuchim. Now we have a principle that may peros eno machmitzim, that when you add fruit juices to a flour, it does not cause chib, it causes sirachon. The Gemara uses the term something that's not it's not real leavening. But here he's not adding the juice, but rather the fruit itself. And the question is whether fruit can serve as an agent of leavening, of chibutz. The Tanakama holds that ein machmitzah. And Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel says machmitzah. Oh, and Tosfos in Menachos on Daf Nun Gimel points out that we're talking about a case where he's adding not just apples or pieces of apple, but he also adds water. Dafka b'tziruf mayim, because we're going to need this mayim to create chimutz. But if it's the peros alone, or even the may peros, is ein machmitz. All right. Now, this really brings us to a whole new topic for Mitzvah for tomorrow, and that is the topic of pigul. Okay, so that Mitzvah Hashem will pick up